personal concerns, either fears or aspirations aside, and think about what the outcomes might be, as opposed to what the consequences for them of the decision is. That's one thing. And the other is that if you've introduced it correctly, you start with the futures work. And I always start with the kind of view. The one thing that is true about anything you say about the future is that it's not going to be like that. So you created a really safe space in which you can talk about stuff that will not impact the decision maker personally, so they can put themselves to one side, and where nobody has to worry about whether they're right or wrong. And if you free people up from those two concerns, and in this kind of technocratic concept, you're assuming everybody's well-intentioned and everybody's kind of trying to do the right thing in some way. But if you free them up from those concerns, then they have a different conversation from if they think, which in British politics I'm sure elsewhere would be true. Otherwise, what they're saying is just I've got to defend my budget and my minister at all costs, and my discussion will be about how I can make sure that my department gets what it needs for its objectives. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's interesting. As I told you, I've been with the government most of my time, not as a political person, but as well a member of the civil of the whole system in this way. I was a bureaucrat in reality, but with different types of functions. But one thing that strikes me in this, because you started with the disasters, and this is naturally very hands-on and a short period, and because we had an example when there was a tsunami in Thailand, and lots of Swedes were there and were got killed. It was a major operation that had to start to get at them and to know. Now the government made a serious mistake, I think, at the very top. They did not really realize that there were many Swedes there. So they started to think in terms of development cooperation, and that this was something for reorganizing societies and so on, including Myanmar, for instance, and not only Thailand. Whereas I think 24 or 48 hours were lost in getting the right picture of the situation. And I think that because a country like Sweden has an embassy in Bangkok, which is more or less 4 or 5 people sent out from Sweden. We don't have the resources of the United Kingdom. And this was also happening at the time, immediately after Christmas, when in fact there were enormous lot of Swedes in Thailand, but there were very few people who could act in the ministry and so on. And I was just saying this, that a few years before I have been in charge of administration in the ministry, and the then minister would have been on the telephone in the morning already to me saying, send down all the people you can find to build up some people, to build up the number of people that are needed in this situation. But instead the government, the same party but other people, reacted in a totally different way. And there was a lot of trouble for the government after that, explaining how could you do it this way, and because nothing really happened for two days, 48 hours. And so I think this is an example that in this kind of case you are in a very different situation than when you speak about future urbanization of the system. I know in local in the local field, there are all sorts of ideas about the way in which cities will look. Some are very maybe probable, but others improbable. Whatever. In a country like Sweden, the government does not. The central government has only rather limited resources at its disposal to deal with issues related to urbanization and the future shape of cities.
Thank you.
So one thing, this is not a direct response, if you like, but one thing I would say is that the kind of thinking that the futures thinking that I've been talking about is only in pockets, but is actually more widespread. So the European Commission has a thing called the Joint Research Centre, which was a rather dusty set of laboratories, with all great respect to it, and has repositioned itself as the EC's knowledge management service, and is doing some really interesting work on futures and on gaming and on behavioural change, for example. This kind of thinking comes in because it doesn't fit with normal categories, it comes in different guises. The US has a body that supports Congress called the Government Accountability Office, which sounds really boring, and I think deliberately sounds really boring. But what it does is essentially audit policies that are, when they're being discussed by Congress. And it used to be almost exclusively economic, and it is now very deliberately using much more wider range of disciplines and using futures thinking to enable Congress people to have access to evidence in these new forms. I think what I'm saying is it comes in different places at different times, but I do think, one other thing though is, I mean, if I understand it rightly, the question of what happens if a disaster gets wrongly framed, as in if it's framed as a development issue when in fact it might have been one as well about citizens, that's really interesting because the Badgers story is also partly one about the problems you get into if you get locked into the wrong, in quotes, the wrong framing of an issue. And there is some evidence from the political sciences that that can happen, and it can happen at moments of crisis, so you need to be really, really careful, because then it's very hard to undo it, so yeah.
It's so interesting. As we were talking this morning, I'm interested in this question of the speed or the temporality of climate change, which I know is an issue of concern to most of us in this room, and whether it's getting presented as a tornado issue or an abortion one. And I think the other thing with the tornado and the abortion difference that you talked about that is interesting to me is not just whether it's a science issue or a values issue, but a speed issue. And one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is this growth of a narrative of speed around the climate change debate. If this doesn't happen in 12 years, we're stuffed. And I'm wondering what that might lock in terms of responses. Do we risk getting ourselves into seeing it as a budget issue and a development issue as opposed to something else? So I don't know if you want to think about time or temporality and how that relates to the different ways in which we might speak or think together about the knowledge that we need.
Gosh.
We can save that for dinner.
There's a very simple answer, which is true but not useful, which is all of them. So I mean, I almost feel like the bigger the question, and climate change is, one of the very biggest, the more I'm beginning to feel there's even a question about whether it's the right question to be asking.
Yes, yeah. Do you think it is? I mean, do you think we should be asking? I'm not sure.
No.
Because it gets so big, it gets so amorphous.
Yes, exactly.
It then gets stuck in particular
and
boxes.
also because we may have run. I'm taking way off piece. I don't. But, we may have run its course in a way, in the sense we may have gone as far with that framing as we're going to get.
Yeah.
And in a good way. Increasingly the consequences are embedded in all these other areas, so it becomes an equalities issue, say, or a migration issue, or a conflict issue, or a health issue, or a food issue, or whatever it might be, all of those, rather than trying to have climate encompass them all.
I suppose the risk then, though, is that then flows, and it does the thing that you've said with your systems map for obesity, 'cause it sort of hides in a whole variety of different
Yes,
disciplines.
yes,
And then the question
yes.
is, how do you pull it back together
Yes.
as a narrative?
Scary.
And I think one of the questions for me is precisely how we do that, moving between
Yes.
scales and framing this in. Maybe what we're talking about is a need to be fluid in our framings. So rather than it's either
Yes.
the big thing or
But
the
then
micro.
the question becomes, how do you relate that to people who don't like phrases like fluid in our framings?
Yeah.
Which is unfortunately most of the people not in this room. The other thing.
Any advice on communication is good.
And actually, I suppose, in a sense, I think quite often in situations like this, it's like probably all of us here have some connection in why we're here and what we want to achieve or what we believe. And we want to keep some of that. There's a slide I took out, which was about how long-term change is being achieved in some quite difficult areas, and a really key factor is relationships. Not surprisingly. Sorry, do you want to last? Can I give you the...
Keep doing it, yeah.
Okay, so there was a very interesting study done by a thing called the Institute for Governments, which is in the UK. It looked at 6 areas of policy where over a period of time there'd been a change that you wouldn't have predicted when it began. So the complete ban on smoking in all public places, an introduction of a national minimum wage, and the 3 other things, and the carbon budgets. And it kind of did quite a fine-grained case evaluation of how decisions over decades had come and gone that had led from a position where that would have seemed highly unlikely to it being completely politically acceptable.